God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. It is 1882. A wandering, solitary German philosopher writes these words, capturing the terrifying realization of the modern age. The absolute truths that held Europe together for centuries are dissolving. Science has explained the stars, but it hasn't explained why we are here. And into this void steps a man who sees two possibilities: a descent into total meaninglessness, or the rise of a new kind of human who can create their own values. Tonight, we unravel the life of Friedrich Nietzsche, the man who stared into the abyss until the abyss stared back. He is perhaps the most misunderstood thinker in history. To some, he is the godfather of fascism, his words twisted by his sister to court the Nazis. To others, he is the ultimate rebel, the prophet of individualism who urged us to become who we are. In this episode, we'll trace his journey from a devout pastor's son to the Antichrist of philosophy. We'll see how he predicted the catastrophes of the 20th century, why he broke with his friend Richard Wagner, and how his search for meaning in a godless world offers a path that is still startlingly relevant today. Before we begin tonight's episode, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps others discover these explorations of history. And let us know in the comments which topics you'd like us to explore next. So, settle in and prepare to walk the high road of thought with a man who risked his sanity, all to find a reason to say yes to life. This is the untold story of Friedrich Nietzsche. Chapter 1. The Little Pastor. It starts in the autumn of 1844, in a village called Rücken, tucked into the Prussian province of Saxony. The date is the 15th of October, which happens to be the 49th birthday of the Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV. The baby's father, a Lutheran pastor named Karl Ludwig Nietzsche, takes this coincidence as a sign from heaven. He names his son Friedrich Wilhelm, after the monarch himself. The pastor is a passionate royalist. He sees providence everywhere. The vicarage sits surrounded by ponds and willow trees, with the church tower rising above it all. Inside, the household is dominated by women. There is Fritz's mother, Franziska, his grandmother, Erdmuth, two maiden aunts, Auguste and Rosalie. Karl Ludwig is the only man, and he is a cultured, gentle presence. He plays the piano with real skill. The infant Fritz sits in his pram, listening, mesmerized by the music. It is one of his earliest memories. Then, in September of 1848, everything changes. Karl Ludwig collapses. The doctors diagnose something they call softening of the brain, a vague and terrifying phrase for a degenerative condition they do not fully understand. He suffers terrible pain. He goes blind. His mind begins to dissolve. On the 27th of July, 1849, he dies. He is 35 years old. The autopsy reveals that a quarter of his brain is simply gone. Fritz is 4 years old. He will later write that at an early age he lost his father, and with him his only friend. A few months later, the boy has a dream. He hears organ music drifting from the church, the same music that played at his father's funeral. A grave opens. His father emerges, wrapped in a linen shroud. He walks into the church and comes back out carrying a small child. Then he descends into the grave again. The lid closes. The organ falls silent. The very next day, Fritz's younger brother, Ludwig Joseph, is seized by convulsions. He dies on the 4th of January, 1850. The dream has come true. The baby is buried in his father's arms. Fritz is now the only male in a house full of grieving women. The family must vacate the vicarage to make room for the new pastor. In April of 1850, they moved to Naumburg, a medieval town enclosed by walls and locked at the gates each night. The transition terrifies the boy. He has known only the open countryside of Röken. Now there are paved streets, crowds, noise. He retreats into books and music. Sorry for the interruption. This is Charles from History After Dark, a channel that is entirely viewer-funded. I cannot produce these deep-dive documentaries without your direct support. A pledge of just a few dollars a month via Patreon or as a YouTube member provides the material base that keeps this channel alive. In return for your solidarity, you gain early access to episodes, direct voting rights on future topics, and a completely ad-free experience. Thank you. Now, back to the story. They call him the Little Pastor. He can recite Bible verses with such feeling that grown men weep. His childhood games are serious, almost ceremonial. He builds an altar in the garden and burns incense. He composes hymns. His sister, Elisabeth, 2 years younger, becomes his first disciple. He calls her Lama. He creates an imaginary kingdom ruled by a porcelain squirrel called King Squirrel I. The children stage elaborate plays and ceremonies for this monarch. Fritz writes the scripts, the poems, the music. It is a closed world where he is the creator and the ruler. His piety runs deep. At 13, he writes in a private note that he has firmly resolved to dedicate himself forever to God's service. He asks the Lord to give him strength to carry out his intentions, to protect him on his life's way. Whatever comes, happiness or unhappiness, poverty or wealth, he will accept. He will even look death boldly in the face. He attends the Cathedral Grammar School in Naumburg. Already, he suffers from severe headaches and eye strain. Despite the pain, he drives himself relentlessly, working until midnight and rising at 5 in the morning. He makes his first real friends here. Wilhelm Pinder, the sensitive son of a wealthy lawyer, Gustav Krug, a talented musician whose father is a magistrate. The three boys bond over music and poetry and a shared sense that they are somehow different from everyone else. When the Crimean War breaks out in 1854, the boys become obsessed. They stage the siege of Sebastopol in the garden with tin soldiers and homemade explosives. Fritz studies military lexicons. He memorizes details about fortifications and ballistics. War fascinates him. He is a model of Prussian obedience. One afternoon, caught in a heavy downpour after school, he walks home slowly while other boys run. His mother scolds him for getting soaked. He replies calmly that the school rules forbid jumping and running in the street. Boys must walk home quietly and decorously. His grandfather, David Oler, a country parson who loves to hunt, recognizes something in the boy. He tells Franziska that Fritz is more talented than all his own sons put together. The grandfather's library becomes Fritz's sanctuary. By 14, Fritz has won a scholarship to Pforta, the most prestigious boarding school in Germany. Everyone assumes he will follow his father into the Lutheran ministry. He is brilliant, pious, and fatherless. He prays to what he calls the unknown God. He dedicates altars in the depths of his heart. The security of Naumburg is about to fall away. The little pastor is heading into the crucible of Prussian education, carrying his Bible and his father's memory, unaware that the very tools of scholarship he is about to master will one day become the weapons he uses to dismantle the faith that currently sustains him. Chapter 2. Pforta and the Prussian Mould. In October of 1858, a 14-year-old boy passed through the high stone walls of Pforta and into a world that would shape him forever. The school had once been a Cistercian monastery, and it still felt like one. Cold corridors, bells marking every hour. The rector spoke of instilling a virile, severe, and powerful spirit of discipline, and he meant it. The day began at 4 in the morning during summer, 5 in winter. A prefect would shout through the dormitory, "Get up, make haste." Any boy slow to rise faced punishment. They had 10 minutes to wash, dress, and prepare for morning prayers. Then came the lessons: Greek, Latin, Hebrew, French, mathematics, history, hour after hour, day after day, year after year. Obedience was the highest virtue. The outside world barely existed. And yet, for all its rigor, Pforta was not entirely a prison. The boys ate well: meat, soup, vegetables, beer or wine on Sundays. They swam in the river Saale when the weather allowed, skated on it when it froze. They hiked through the surrounding hills. Fritz developed a physical robustness during these years that would seem impossible to reconcile with the fragile man he later became, though the headaches never really left him. They worsened during periods of stress, which at Pforta meant most of the time. It was here that he fell in love with the Greeks. He read Aeschylus and Sophocles and Plato in the original language, not translations. He absorbed the Greek concept of the agon, the contest, the drive to excel and defeat one's rivals. The school aimed to produce the spiritual leadership of Prussia, and for a while it seemed Fritz might become exactly that: a model student, a future pillar of the establishment. But cracks were forming. He discovered the poetry of Friedrich Hölderlin, a then obscure writer who had gone mad. In an essay, Fritz praised Hölderlin as his favorite poet, celebrating what he called the holy pathos of the work. His teacher returned the paper with a dismissive comment. Hölderlin was eccentric. Such interests were unhealthy. A young man of promise should look elsewhere. It was a small moment, easily forgotten, but it was also the first collision between Fritz's romantic instincts and the dry academic world that surrounded him. In 1860, he and 2 friends founded a secret society. They called it Germania. They met at the ruins of Schönburg Castle, swore allegiance to the trinity of friendship, art, and science, and sealed the pact by hurling a bottle of wine into the valley below. Each month they would submit artistic or literary compositions for mutual criticism. It was through Germania that Fritz first encountered the music of Richard Wagner. They subscribed to a music journal and purchased a piano reduction of Tristan und Isolde. Fritz and his friend Krug played it four-handed, howling the vocal parts like wolves, scandalizing the neighbors. This was the first infection of what might be called the Wagner virus. Meanwhile, the historical critical method taught at Pforta was doing its quiet work. Fritz learned to dissect texts, to question authorship, to see myths as historical constructs rather than divine truths. He began applying this method to the Bible. The seamless garment of his childhood piety started to tear. In 1862, he wrote an essay for Germania titled Fate and History. If we could examine Christian doctrine with a free, unconstrained eye, he argued, we would be compelled to arrive at many conclusions which contradict generally accepted ideas. He questioned the existence of God. He questioned the authority of Scripture. He was 17 years old. There was a brief rebellion. He associated with the school's bad boys, drank alcohol, smoked, neglected his duties as a prefect. He wrote a blasphemous poem about a drunk hurling a bottle at a crucifix. One Sunday he got properly drunk and was stripped of his prefect's status. He wrote a groveling letter home. I have misbehaved very badly, and I do not know whether you can or will forgive me. The rebellion didn't last. He returned to his studies, threw himself into philology, the study of ancient languages. He chose it deliberately. He needed a discipline that could be pursued with equanimity. He wrote, something conducted with cool, level-headedness and logical coldness, a counterweight to his volatile emotions. He graduated in September of 1864 with a glowing report, physically exhausted after 6 years inside what he would later call a state within a state. Before leaving, he wrote a poem called To the Unknown God. It was a prayer of desperation and longing. I must know you, unknown one, you who reach deep into my soul. I must know you. I will serve you. The childhood God was dead, but the religious instinct remained violently alive, searching for something new to worship. Chapter 3. The Student and the Shock of Schopenhauer. October 1864. Nietzsche arrives at the University of Bonn with his old Pforta friend Paul Deussen, and for the first time in his life, he is free. They tour the Rhineland together, giddy with liberty. He would later write that one must experience constraint in order to savor freedom. He had experienced plenty of constraint. Now came the savoring. He threw himself into student life with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent years in a Prussian boarding school. He joined the Franconia fraternity. He wore the colored cap and sash. He drank beer in quantities that would have horrified his pious mother back in Naumburg. He participated in the ritualized singing and the ritualized dueling, and he fought a duel with a student from a rival corps that left a scar on the bridge of his nose, a mark of honor, they called it. He would carry it for the rest of his life. the novelty wore off quickly. What had seemed like freedom began to feel like a different kind of prison. The intellectual shallowness of his fraternity brothers appalled him. The noise, the nationalism, the beer-soaked Philistinism. He handed in his resignation to the club leaders with a letter that did not mince words. He could no longer feel at home in their midst, he told them. He held a different view of what it meant to be a German student. They reacted with hostility and scorn, which probably surprised no one. Easter 1865 brought the final rupture with Christianity. Back home in Naumburg, he refused to accompany his mother to communion. A terrible row ensued. Franziska wept. Elisabeth was horrified. Nietzsche stood firm. He had read David Strauss's Life of Jesus, which treated the Gospels as myths rather than history. He had made his choice. If you wish for peace of soul and pleasure, then believe, he told them. If you wish to be a devotee of truth, then inquire. The little pastor was dead. Disillusioned with Bonn and its beer corpse culture, he transferred to Leipzig that autumn to follow his beloved professor Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was the father figure he craved, a rigorous and brilliant philologist who demanded absolute precision. Under his guidance, Nietzsche flourished, but the real transformation came from somewhere else entirely. November 1865. Feeling lonely and aimless, Nietzsche wandered into a second-hand bookshop. He was browsing without intent when a book by an author he had never heard of seemed to call to him from the shelf. Arthur Schopenhauer, The World as Will and Representation. He later recalled that he took the book in his hand as if guided by a demon. He ran home with his treasure, threw himself into the corner of his sofa, and let that gloomy, energetic genius begin to work on him. Schopenhauer's philosophy hit him like a revelation. The world is driven by a blind, irrational will. Existence is suffering. The only escape lies through aesthetic contemplation or the ascetic denial of the will itself. Nietzsche found in these pages a mirror for his own internal struggles. He saw sickness and health, exile and refuge, hell and heaven, all depicted with frightful grandeur. He underwent something like a conversion. He subjected himself to a regime of asceticism, sleeping only 4 hours a night until his health collapsed. He became a Schopenhauerian evangelist, preaching the gospel of pessimism to anyone who would listen. In 1867, he was called up for military service. He joined a mounted artillery regiment in Naumburg and discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he enjoyed it. The discipline and physical exertion felt like an antidote to his bookish life. He was a good soldier, promoted to bombardier. But his military career ended abruptly the following March, when he struck his chest against the pommel of his saddle while mounting a spirited horse. He tore 2 muscles and suffered a severe inflammation. He lay in bed for months, looked after by his mother, using the time to write philological essays that astonished the academic world. He returned to Leipzig a star pupil, publishing papers in respected journals, brilliant, respected, but inwardly alienated from the dry dust of philology. He yearned for something more, a living culture, a fusion of art and life. On the 8th of November, 1868, he was invited to the house of Professor Brockhaus to meet a guest who was visiting incognito, Richard Wagner. Nietzsche had ordered a new suit for the occasion, but got into a fight with the tailor's assistant at the door and arrived in his old clothes, rain-soaked and flustered. It hardly mattered. Wagner played the piano, talked of Schopenhauer with what Nietzsche described as indescribable warmth, and mocked the professors. He saw in the 24-year-old philologist a kindred spirit. Nietzsche was captivated. He wrote afterwards that he had found a man who revealed to him what Schopenhauer called the genius, a fabulously lively and fiery man. The meeting would change everything. Within months, Nietzsche would be thrust into a position of immense prestige and responsibility, skipping the usual academic hurdles to become the youngest professor in his university's history. His fate was now bound to Wagner's cause, and the stage was set for his first great philosophical explosion. Chapter 4. The Youngest Professor. In early 1869, something close to a miracle happened. The chair of classical philology at the University of Basel fell vacant, and the departing professor wrote to Friedrich Nietzsche asking for a recommendation. Nietzsche was famous for terrorizing students with his impossibly high standards. He did not hand out praise easily. But for Nietzsche, he wrote a reference that bordered on the hyperbolic. In 39 years of teaching, he said he had never known a young man who had matured so early. He would simply be able to do anything he wanted to do. Basel was desperate to fill the post. They appointed the 24-year-old as an extraordinary professor on February 12th, even though he had not yet completed his doctorate. Leipzig, caught up in the excitement, hastily awarded him the degree without an examination based solely on his published papers. Nietzsche became a professor at an age when most young men were still students. He left behind what he called the golden time of student freedom. On April 17th, he traveled to Basel and surrendered his Prussian citizenship to satisfy the university's requirement of neutrality. He became legally stateless, a status he would retain for the rest of his life. The city he arrived in was slowly shedding its medieval skin. Ancient walls were being demolished to make way for the railway. But the citizens still valued their quiet. They closed the city gates at night so they could sleep the sleep of the just. He settled into a routine of intense work and high society. His first room was fairly horrible, near the Spallentor gate. Later he moved to a terrace house on Schützengraben, which he shared with a theologian named Franz Overbeck. They called it the Poison Cottage. Despite early complaints about Swiss patriotism and inedible cheese, Nietzsche became a fixture in Basel's patrician circles. He attended balls and dinners where young women were enchanted by his politeness and his story that he had once dreamt he was a camellia. But the true center of his emotional life lay elsewhere. At Tribschen, a promontory on Lake Lucerne, Richard Wagner lived in political exile in a large house decorated in lavish Rococo style, all pink satin and little cupids. On May 15th, Nietzsche made his first unannounced visit. He stood nervously outside, listening to a plaintive chord repeated on the piano, the Siegfried chord. He knocked. The master was working, but he was invited back for dinner 2 days later. Nietzsche became a surrogate son to Wagner, who happened to be the same age his father would have been. He visited Tribschen 23 times in 3 years, often staying in his own designated room, which they called the thinking room. He ran errands for Cosima Wagner, shopping in Basel for her specific demands: a few pounds of caramel sweets, a bag of fruit confits, orange glacés. He witnessed the chaotic household a strange mix of genius, children, and animal idolatry. The high point came on Christmas Day, 1870. Nietzsche was there when Wagner woke Cosima with a symphonic birthday greeting, performed by 15 musicians crammed onto the staircase. The piece would later be known as the Siegfried Idyll. The entire household wept with joy. Nietzsche gave Cosima a manuscript of his own work and received a copy of Wagner's essay on Beethoven in return. He would later remember Tribschen as a distant isle of the blessed, where no cloud ever passed over their sky. Then the Franco-Prussian War broke out in July 1870. Nietzsche was caught up in the patriotic fervor. He applied for leave to serve, but his Swiss neutrality meant he could only work as a medical orderly. After 10 days of training in Erlangen, learning to bandage wounds, he was sent to the front. He witnessed the aftermath of the Battle of Worth, a field covered with body parts and stinking corpses. His romantic illusions about war dissolved in the mud. He was assigned to a cattle truck to transport 6 severely wounded men back to Germany. For 3 days and nights, in a closed wagon with no ventilation, he tended to men with shattered bones and gangrene. He fed them, bandaged them, attended to their human needs amidst the stench of disease and death. The experience broke him. He contracted dysentery and diphtheria from the wounded men. He collapsed in Erlangen, suffering from intestinal inflammation that would plague him for the rest of his life. Treated with silver nitrate and opium, he lay in a hotel room, hallucinating and traumatized. He returned to Basel in October, physically wrecked and psychologically scarred, haunted by what he called the terrible images of the battlefield. A gloomy fog, he wrote, had surrounded him. It would not lift for a long time. Chapter 5. The Birth of Tragedy. In January of 1872, Nietzsche finally went public. His first book carried a peculiar title, The Birth of Tragedy, Out of the Spirit of Music. The cover announced him as a professor of classical philology, which was true enough. But the contents were something else entirely. Part scholarship, part philosophy, part love letter to Wagner. He was 27 years old, and he was swinging for the fences. The book introduced a distinction that would outlive him by more than a century. On one side stood the Apollonian, the world of beautiful forms, of dreams, of the individual standing apart. On the other lurked the Dionysian, the god of wine and madness, where all boundaries collapsed into a terrifying primal unity. Most scholars had painted the ancient Greeks as serene, rational creatures basking in Mediterranean sunshine. Nietzsche saw something darker. He believed they had stared directly into the horror of existence and built their art as a shield against it. He cited an old legend to make his point. King Midas once captured Silenus, the companion of Dionysus, and demanded to know what was best for mankind. The daemon laughed shrilly before answering. "The very best thing," he said, "is utterly beyond your reach. Not to have been born, not to be nothing. However, the second best thing for you is to die soon." This was the wisdom the Greeks had tried to survive. Tragedy was their solution. Through the Dionysian chorus, the individual spectator could surrender his fragile ego and merge with something eternal. He could glimpse that life at the bottom of things, despite all the changes of appearances, remained indestructibly powerful and pleasurable. The art form had offered what Nietzsche called metaphysical comfort, and then Socrates killed it. The theoretical optimist who believed reason could correct existence had murdered the mythic depth of Greek culture. This was Nietzsche's accusation. Having diagnosed the ancient illness, he prescribed a modern cure. German culture had grown sluggish and senile, he wrote. Only the fire magic of Richard Wagner's music could revive it. He was calling for a rebirth of the German myth, and he expected the world to listen. The world did not listen. Nietzsche waited for a sensation that never arrived. His colleagues simply ignored the book. Students in Leipzig were quietly warned against studying at Basel. For months, nothing. Then, in May, a pamphlet appeared titled Philology of the Future. The author was a young scholar named Ulrich von Wilhelmovitz Mullendorf, and he had come to bury Nietzsche, not to praise him. The attack was savage. Wilhelmovitz mocked Nietzsche's errors, his mystical pretensions, his ignorance, his lack of love for truth. He concluded with a theatrical flourish. Let the professor gather his tigers and panthers to his knee, he wrote, referring to the beasts that pulled Dionysus's chariot, and then let him resign his teaching chair rather than corrupt the youth of Germany. Friedrich Nietzsche, the mentor who had launched Nietzsche's career with such enthusiasm, was appalled. He wrote a pained letter describing the book as fantastic, exaggerated, art mysticism rhapsodizing. He accused his former protégé of impiety against his true mother, meaning philology itself. Another colleague, Hermann Usner, delivered the verdict more bluntly. Scientifically, he declared, Nietzsche is dead. The damage showed up in his lecture hall. When the winter semester began, not a single student from the philology department enrolled in his classes. He sat in empty rooms. Eventually, he found 2 students from other faculties willing to listen to him, and that was all. He tried to find comfort in music. In July, he sent a composition called The Manfred Meditation to Hans von Bülow, one of the most famous conductors in Europe. The response crushed him. Von Bülow called it the most extreme piece of fantastic extravagance, the least uplifting and most anti-musical set of marks on manuscript paper he had encountered in a long time. He asked if perhaps it was a joke. He called it a crime against the moral order of music. Nietzsche accepted the criticism with surprising grace, promising like a chastised schoolboy not to do it again. But if the scholars had abandoned him, the Wagnerians had not. The master himself wrote that the book was terrific. Cosima noted in her diary that it marked the start of a new era. In May, Nietzsche traveled to Bayreuth for the laying of the foundation stone of the Festival Theatre. Rain poured down, turning the construction site into a sea of mud. The mood was ecstatic anyway. He sat in the Margrave's Rococo Opera House, listening to Beethoven's Ninth, feeling that he was witnessing the dawn of something unprecedented. And yet, in his private notebooks, doubts had begun to surface. He found himself dissecting what he called the tyrannical nature of Wagner. He wondered whether the art he had championed was truly a rebirth of the Greek spirit or merely hypnotic trickery designed to overpower the nerves. He noted that Wagner allowed validity to no other individuality save his own. For a supposed cultural savior, this seemed like a dangerous trait. He kept publishing. His untimely meditations attacked the cultural philistinism of the age, the historical sickness of scholars who buried themselves in facts instead of using the past to inspire the future. He held up Schopenhauer as the educator who could teach a man to go against his times, to be untimely in the best sense. But privately, he complained of the dizzying haste of modern life, the factory work of academia, the trap of his university duties. The tension was building. His public role as Wagner's champion sat uneasily with the questions multiplying in his notebooks. As the first Bayreuth festival approached, the Isle of the Blessed began to look less like paradise and more like a gilded cage. Nietzsche would arrive not quite as a disciple anymore, something sharper, colder, a spy in the house of his idol, carrying a secret judgment that would eventually shatter everything. Chapter 6. Disillusionment in Bayreuth. In August of 1874, Nietzsche arrived at Bayreuth with a red book tucked into his suitcase. It was the score of Johannes Brahms's Triumphlid. Brahms represented everything Wagner despised: conservative, classical, sober. Nietzsche placed the score on the piano at Wahnfried, Wagner's grand new home, and waited. Wagner later said it acted like a red rag to a bull. One evening, Nietzsche insisted the maestro sit and listen. Wagner erupted. He screamed that he had no interest in hearing music composed by a man who made nothing but musical jewelry. Nietzsche sat there, blushing, but holding himself with what observers called a distinguished dignity, while Wagner nearly tore himself apart with rage. Afterward, Wagner shouted to anyone who would listen that Nietzsche had flown out of the door, and now he was supposed to love Brahms, on whose account he had lost his Nietzsche. They papered over the rift, but something had shifted. Nietzsche began to see his idol differently, not as a god remaking German culture, but as an actor, a tyrant who demanded total submission from everyone around him. He scribbled in his notebook that the danger for Wagner was great when he refused to let Brahms be valid, or the Jews. It was the first time Nietzsche explicitly connected Wagner's need for dominance to his anti-Semitism. 2 years later, in the summer of 1876, the first Bayreuth Festival finally opened. Nietzsche attended, hoping to witness the cultural revolution he had predicted in the birth of tragedy. What he found instead was a fairground. The audience was not the gathering of untimely spirits he had envisioned. It was the loafing riffraff of Europe. Fat bourgeois spectators, princes, socialites who had come to be seen rather than transformed. The heat inside the theater was insane. The building became a sweatbox, and the art itself seemed to rely on mechanical contrivances and special effects rather than tragic myth. The mechanical dragon Fafner arrived with no neck because someone had shipped it to Beirut instead of Bayreuth. The Rhine maidens whirled around on mechanical carousels. This was not the rebirth of tragedy. This was grand opera with better stagecraft. Nietzsche watched it all with mounting horror. His headaches flared. His stomach revolted. Overwhelmed by physical agony and disgust, he fled the festival in the middle of the ring cycle. He retreated to Klingenbrunn in the Bohemian forest, where he sat in a small room and buried his head in his hands. He wrote to his sister with tears in his eyes, "Oh, Lisbeth," so that was Bayreuth. He realized his task had been withdrawn from him. The Wagnerian ideal was a fata morgana, a mirage shimmering over the desert. In that small room, he began writing a new kind of book. Gone was the flowery academic prose of his earlier work. In its place came something sharp and cold, aphorisms that cut like surgical instruments. He called it the plowshare, the tool that breaks up old soil. It would eventually become human, all too human, a turn toward what he called positivism, a scientific dissection of the soul, influenced by his new friend Paul Rée, a Jewish rationalist whom the anti-Semitic Wagners despised. Despite his intellectual break, Nietzsche remained emotionally tethered. He returned to Bayreuth for the final performances, unable to stay away from what he called the liquid gold of Wagner's music. He fell into a brief, intense flirtation with a French woman named Louise Ott. He wrote to her afterward that it was dark around him when she left Bayreuth. "Why does no one look at me with such eyes?" It was a rare moment of erotic charge in his life. It faded quickly, with distance and propriety. The final break with Wagner was silent but total. Nietzsche left Bayreuth in late August of 1876. He never saw Wagner again. He traveled to Sorrento, Italy, with Paul Rée and Albert Brenner. Together, they set up what Nietzsche called a monastery for free spirits at the Villa Rubinacci. They lived a communal life, reading Voltaire and Michelet, walking through orange groves, dissecting the illusions of metaphysics and religion. In Sorrento, Nietzsche encountered Wagner one last time. Wagner was also recovering in Italy and warned Nietzsche about Rée's influence, hinting darkly at Rée's Jewishness. Nietzsche, now firmly opposed to anti-Semitism, was repulsed when Wagner sent him the text of his new opera, Parsifal. Nietzsche read it with disgust. He saw it as a cowardly return to Christianity, a spirit of the Counter-Reformation. He wrote in his notebook, "Incredible. Wagner has become pious." In May of 1878, Nietzsche sent his published copy of Human, All Too Human to Wagner. By a twist of fate, Wagner's gift of the Parsifal libretto crossed it in the post, a symbolic exchange of swords. Wagner was horrified by the book, which he saw as a betrayal of everything they had stood for together, a cold, rationalist attack on genius and sainthood. He never wrote to Nietzsche again. Nietzsche was isolated now, but he was free. He had become what he called the free spirit, engaged in a campaign against the present, armed with nothing but his pen and his terrible, liberating honesty. The umbilical cord to his spiritual father had been severed. What lay ahead was wandering, physical agony, and a shadow existence where he would have to forge a new philosophy from the wreckage of his health and his broken relationships. Chapter 7. The Wanderer. On the 2nd of May, 1879, Nietzsche dictated a letter to the University of Basel. He was resigning his professorship. He was 34 years old, but his body had given up on him so completely that he felt like an old man trapped in the shell of a younger one. He wrote that he was at the end of his 35th year. an age when most men are considered to be in the prime of life. Yet he was so physically broken that he had no choice but to step down. His eyesight was failing. He could read or write for only 20 minutes at a stretch before the pain became unbearable. He suffered violent headaches that lasted for days, accompanied by waves of vomiting that left him hollow and trembling. During the worst attacks, he would lie in a darkened room, unable to move, waiting for the storm in his skull to pass. The university granted him a modest pension of 3,000 francs a year. It was enough to survive on. Barely. He became a fugitive, a nomad drifting between Switzerland, Italy, and Germany, always searching for the one climate that might ease his torture. He described himself during this period as a shadow. In the book he was writing, The Wanderer and His Shadow, he constructed a dialogue between himself and his own shadow, the only companion left to him in his solitude. He shed the professor and became what he called the free spirit, owning almost nothing, living out of a single trunk. He tried street Moritz in the summer of that year, hoping the high altitude would help. It was a disaster. It rained constantly. He lived on a diet of fruit, rusks, and vegetable soup, trying to imitate Diogenes. He returned to Naumburg to stay with his mother, a weary man prematurely aged, but the low, damp air of the lowlands made everything worse. He called it his lowest point. Eventually, he found a haven in Genoa. He rented a cheap attic room at Salita delle Battistine, number 8. To reach it, he had to climb 164 stone steps. The room was unheated, and in winter his fingers turned blue with cold, but he loved the isolation. He lived among the working class. His landlady cooked him artichokes and eggs. The neighbors called him Il Piccolo Santo, the little saint, because of his gentle manners and his solitary habits. He lived with extreme frugality. He wrote that he had separated from everything that was not truly his own. He avoided visitors. He walked for 6 to 8 hours a day, notebook in hand, scribbling thoughts as he went. All truly great thoughts are conceived while walking, he later said, and he discovered a new way of writing, the aphorism. Because his eyes could not bear the strain of long, continuous prose, he wrote in short, sharp bursts. These became the books Dawn and The Gay Science. In the summer of 1881, seeking escape from the coastal heat, he stumbled upon the village of Sils Maria in the Upper Engadine, high in the Swiss Alps. It sat 1,800 meters above sea level. He found a room in the house of the local mayor, Herr Durisch, for 1 franc a day. The room was unheated, paneled in dark pine, with a single table and chair. He fell in love with the place. He called it heroic idyllic. He felt the high mountain air was the only thing that kept his machine running. His daily routine was rigid. Up at 5 in the morning, wash in cold water, work until 11, lunch at the Hotel Alpenrose, usually steak and macaroni, then a 4-hour walk around Lake Silvaplana or up the Fex Valley, where the light fell strange and silver on the glaciers. Supper was simple: tea, biscuits, sometimes polenta. He had no social life. He wrote to his sister asking for warm socks and German sausage. He was terrified of the electricity in the atmosphere, before thunderstorms, which he believed triggered his migraines. Despite the physical agony, he experienced a tremendous intellectual euphoria. He felt he was conquering his pain, turning it into spirit. He wrote to his friend Overbeck that his life had become a perfect victory over his bodily existence. He called this amor fati, the love of fate. He meant something beyond mere endurance. He meant loving one's life, pain and all, every moment of it. He was lonely. He wrote that he was alone and wanted to be alone, but was also afraid of being alone. He yearned for a disciple, a soulmate who could understand the terrifying new thoughts crowding his mind. And then, in the midst of this solitary struggle, he received a letter from his friend Paul Ray. Ray mentioned a young Russian woman who had arrived in Rome, a woman of heroic character and brilliant intellect. Nietzsche, starved for intellectual companionship, packed his bags and headed south, unaware that he was walking into a trap that would break his heart. Chapter 8. The Lou Salomé Disaster. In the spring of 1882, Nietzsche arrived at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome to meet a young Russian woman named Lou Salomé. She was 21 years old. He had prepared a greeting, the kind only a philosopher would think appropriate. He bowed before her and asked, "From which stars have we been brought here together?" Lou was small and blonde, with a sharp intellect and a will to match. She had already turned down one marriage proposal from a former tutor back in Russia, and she had no intention of becoming anyone's wife. She wanted a life of ideas, free from what she called the slavery of traditional marriage. Nietzsche saw something in her immediately. He believed he had found not merely a woman, but a kindred spirit, the heir he had been waiting for. What he did not know, or chose not to see, was that his friend Paul Ray had also fallen in love with her. The three of them hatched an unusual plan. They would form a kind of intellectual commune, a sexless arrangement where they could live and study together in Paris or Vienna. Nietzsche called it a monastery for free spirits. He believed with all his heart that this was the beginning of something new. Within days, he was so captivated that he asked Ray to propose to Lou on his behalf. A marriage of souls, he called it, mostly to make their living arrangement respectable. Lou rejected him, just as she had rejected Ray. She wanted freedom. Nietzsche accepted the refusal and clung to whatever scraps of connection she would allow. In early May, the three of them traveled to Lake Pforta in northern Italy. While the others rested, Nietzsche and Lou hiked up the Monte Sacro together. They were gone for hours. He later called it the most delightful dream of his life. Some say they kissed on that mountain. Whatever happened, Nietzsche came down believing he had finally found someone who understood the depths of his thought. They moved on to Lucerne, where they posed for a photograph in the studio of Jules Bonnet. The image is strange and famous. Nietzsche and Ray stand harnessed to a small cart like horses. Lou sits in the cart behind them, holding a little whip decorated with flowers. She stares at the camera with a look of iron will. Nietzsche arranged the whole tableau himself. It was meant as a joke. It became a prophecy. His sister Elisabeth arrived soon after, and she loathed Lou on sight. Elisabeth saw a threat to her hold over her brother. She called Lou a shameless woman and a dried-up cat. She filled Nietzsche's ears with gossip, claiming Lou boasted about twisting men around her finger. Despite the growing tension, Nietzsche and Lou spent 3 weeks together in Tautenberg, a forest village, that August. They walked through the woods for hours at a time. He opened his soul to her, speaking about the death of God and the weight of existence. He wrote that he had found a golden nugget. He was certain she was the only person capable of understanding the great work taking shape in his mind. Lou, for her part, kept her own counsel. In her diary, she wrote that Nietzsche was undoubtedly a genius, but also a religious nature desperate for a new faith. She found his heroism to be a mask for deep suffering. His mind fascinated her. His emotional neediness did not. The commune never came together. Ray and Lou left Tautenberg. Through his sister's diligent meddling, Nietzsche learned that the two of them called him the clergyman behind his back. They laughed at his pathos. The betrayal cut him open. He descended into a black rage. He wrote letters he never sent, and some he did. He called Lou a monkey with false breasts and a predatory animal. He threatened Ray. He broke with his mother and sister, telling them they had made his life a hell with their provincial morality. He spent the winter of 1882 in Rapallo, on the Italian coast, utterly alone. He took high doses of opium to sleep. He wrote to his friend Overbeck, "This last morsel of life was the hardest I have yet had to chew." He thought about ending it all. His desire for connection, he decided, had been his undoing. The monastery for free spirits had been a delusion. There was no community waiting for him anywhere. He wrote, "I am the most solitary man." The pain of rejection was physical. He vomited for days. And yet, somewhere in that despair, he turned to his own philosophy, amor fati, the love of fate. If he was to affirm life, he had to affirm this too: the humiliation, the loneliness, the betrayal. He would transmute the agony into something else. He wrote, "I want to become a self-propelling wheel." Stripped of his friends, estranged from his family, humiliated in love, Nietzsche was thrown back entirely upon himself. The energy he had directed outward toward Lou now had nowhere to go. It turned inward, building pressure like steam in a sealed chamber. In the solitude of that Rapallo winter, something began to break loose. A voice started roaring in his head, demanding to be written down. Chapter 9. Thus spoke Zarathustra. To understand where this book came from, we need to step back. Before the disaster with Lou, before the humiliation and the suicidal winter, there was a moment of revelation in the Swiss Alps. It was August 1881, and Nietzsche was walking beside Lake Silvaplana during his first summer in Sils Maria. He stopped at a massive pyramidal block of granite near the village of Surled, and there, standing in the thin mountain air, a thought struck him with the force of a lightning bolt. He scribbled on a piece of paper, 6,000 feet beyond man and time. The thought was this: What if you had to live your life over and over again, eternally, with every pain and every joy repeated, every moment of boredom, every heartbreak, every illness, every small defeat? The demon who tells you this, would you curse him, or would you fall to your knees and call him a god? This was the eternal recurrence of the same, and it was the seed of Zarathustra. Now, fast forward to the winter of 1883. Nietzsche is in Rapallo, on the Italian coast. The Lou Salomé affair has shattered him. His sister has poisoned his friendships. He is isolated, sick, and closer to suicide than he has ever been. And yet, out of this despair, something erupts. He writes the first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra in just 10 days. He describes the process as a kind of possession. One hears, one does not seek, he writes. One accepts, one does not ask who gives. A thought flashes out like lightning, with necessity, without hesitation. I have never had any choice. On the 13th of February, 1883, Richard Wagner dies in Venice. Nietzsche takes this as a sign. He calls it the hour of the most holy father. The death of his spiritual father, the man he had loved, then rejected, frees him to become the prophet of his own new religion. Zarathustra is the anti-Wagner, the Antichrist. The book itself is strange. It reads like scripture, like poetry, like a fever dream. Nietzsche uses the cadences of the Luther Bible deliberately, inverting Christian values with Christian language. He felt he had raised German prose to a height it had never reached before. With Zarathustra, he writes, I have given mankind the greatest gift it has ever been given. The protagonist is Zarathustra, the Persian prophet also known as Zoroaster. He descends from a mountain cave after 10 years of solitude to preach to the people in the marketplace. And what does he preach? He returns to the terrifying vision he had written a year earlier in The Gay Science. The vision of a madman running through the marketplace, crying that we have unchained the earth from its sun, that we have wiped away the horizon, that God is dead and we have killed him. In the old world, God provided the compass. Morality came from above. Meaning was given, not made. But now that structure has collapsed, and Nietzsche is terrified of what will fill the void. The danger is nihilism, a belief in nothing, a universe drained of purpose. Against this, Zarathustra preaches the Übermensch. The word is usually translated as Superman or Overman, though neither quite captures it. Man, Zarathustra says, is a rope tied between beast and Übermensch, a rope stretched over an abyss. What is great in man is that he is a bridge, not a destination. The Übermensch is the one who creates their own values, who remains faithful to the earth, who does not look for meaning in some world beyond this one. But Nietzsche doesn't just describe the destination, he describes the journey. In one of the book's most famous passages, Zarathustra speaks of 3 metamorphoses of the spirit. First, the spirit becomes a camel, the beast of burden, who kneels down and asks to be loaded with heavy things. Tradition, duty, inherited morality. What is heaviest? The camel asks, and it takes on the weight of centuries. Then the camel goes into the desert and becomes a lion. The lion cannot create new values. That is not its purpose. but it can destroy the old ones. It can say no to the great dragon called Thou Shalt. Where the camel says I ought, the lion roars I will, it wins for itself the freedom to create. And finally, the lion must become a child. The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a wheel rolling out of itself, a sacred, yes. The child does not carry the burden of the past. The child plays. This is the roadmap for becoming the Übermensch, and Nietzsche sets it against its opposite, the last man. When Zarathustra descends to the marketplace and preaches the Übermensch, the crowd laughs at him. They don't want greatness, they want comfort. Give us this last man, they cry. The last man is Nietzsche's nightmare. He is the blinking, comfortable creature who has given up on anything higher. We have invented happiness, the last men say, and they blink. They work a little. They entertain themselves a little. They take care of their health. They have no ambition, no danger, no creation. They live long, peaceful, meaningless lives. For Nietzsche, the last man is what humanity becomes when it kills God but fails to become the Übermensch, a herd animal, well-fed and docile. Nietzsche wrote the second part of Zarathustra in Sils Maria in the summer of 1883, again in a burst of about 10 days. The third part came in Nice in the winter of 1884. He walked for hours on the cliffs above the Mediterranean, shouting the words into the wind, conducting the rhythm with his umbrella like a mad orchestra leader. He also introduces what he calls the will to power. This is often misunderstood as political domination, but Nietzsche means something different. The will to power is the fundamental drive of all life, not just to survive, but to overcome itself, to expand, to grow. A plant pushing through concrete, an artist wrestling with form. Life, Nietzsche says, is that which must always overcome itself. He published the first 3 parts, expecting the world to be shaken. The reaction was silence. His friends were baffled. Rode, his old ally from the Wagner days, thought it was bookish. Overbeck found it distressing. No one understood it. The book was too strange, too radical, too poetic for the scholars, and too philosophical for the poets. Nietzsche printed only 40 copies of the 4th part privately, because no publisher would touch it. The isolation deepened. He called his friends polite corpses. He began to see his solitude not as a burden, but as a distinction, a necessary distance from the herd. I am one thing, he writes. My writings are another. He was writing for everyone and no one. In Zarathustra, Nietzsche fights his own demons, the spirit of gravity, the desire for revenge, the nausea he felt at the small man. The book is a manual of self-overcoming. Its most famous command is also its simplest. Become who you are. The writing left him exhausted but exalted. He felt he had cut history in 2, had pronounced the verdict on 2,000 years of Christianity. He stood on the peak of his philosophy, looking down at the clouds of European morality below him. But the world had not listened. The silence forced him to change tactics. He could not just preach in parables. He would have to explain, attack, destroy. He sharpened his pen into a scalpel. The poetic heights gave way to the plains of prose. and a total declaration of war on the values of the 19th century. Chapter 10. Beyond Good and Evil. Zarathustra had spoken. The world had not listened. The prophet's voice had echoed across the mountains and returned to him unanswered. And now Nietzsche understood that poetry alone would not be enough. He needed a different weapon, something sharper, something colder. He wrote to his friend Overbeck in 1885 that he was preparing a fishing rod to catch a new kind of reader. The bait would be a book called Beyond Good and Evil, which he described as a prelude to a philosophy of the future. Gone was the biblical cadence of Zarathustra. In its place came prose that cut like surgical steel. Getting the book published proved humiliating. His usual publisher, Schmeitzner, dragged his feet and showed little enthusiasm. Nietzsche broke with him and approached the prestigious house of Breitkopf and Hertel. They rejected the manuscript outright. In the end, he turned to a small publisher named Naumann, but the terms stung. Nietzsche would have to pay for the printing himself. He scraped together the money from his meager pension. He was essentially paying for the privilege of being heard. The book appeared in August of 1886. The response was silence. In its first year, it sold 114 copies. While wrestling with publishers, Nietzsche faced a personal catastrophe that severed him from his family for good. His sister, Elisabeth, had become engaged to a man named Bernhard Förster. Förster was a leading anti-Semite, a former schoolteacher who had been dismissed for his agitation. He was now attempting to found a pure Aryan colony in Paraguay, a place he called Nueva Germania. Nietzsche was physically repulsed. He wrote to his mother that he considered the engagement an insult, that every word from a race fanatic's mouth disgusted him. He refused to attend the wedding, which took place in May of 1885. The ceremony was a festival of Wagnerian and anti-Semitic kitsch. Nietzsche stayed away. When Elisabeth eventually departed for Paraguay the following year, he felt relief tangled with abandonment. He wrote that he now had no one who loved him. The break from what he called the Naumburg virtue was complete. He was homeless in every sense of the word. His winters he spent in Nice, a city he initially distrusted but came to tolerate for its dry air. He stayed in modest pensions and complained about the food. His meals were simple. He avoided alcohol and coffee, drinking water and cocoa instead. He had become obsessed with what he called his dietetics, convinced that wrong food caused his migraines. German spirit, he wrote, is an indigestion. He blamed heavy German cuisine for the nation's intellectual sluggishness. In Beyond Good and Evil, he launched a frontal assault on the prejudices of philosophers. The opening line was deliberately provocative. Supposing truth is a woman, what then? He mocked the dogmatic seriousness of past thinkers, suggesting they had been clumsy suitors who did not know how to handle a woman. What philosophers called truth, he argued, was usually just a confession of their own secret desires, a memoir of their soul. He spoke again of the free spirit, but the tone had darkened since his earlier books. These new free spirits were not merely wandering observers. They were tempters, attempters, philosophers of the dangerous maybe. They had to be strong enough to face the truth that the universe possessed no inherent meaning or moral order, looking into this abyss required what he called a great health, a robustness that most modern people lacked. The book was also a declaration of his own masked nature. Every profound spirit needs a mask, he wrote. His writings were not the full truth of his inner life, but a surface he presented to protect his vulnerability. The hermit hides his true thoughts because they are too dangerous for the herd. He was playing a game of hide and seek with his readers, daring them to find the real Nietzsche behind the bluster. During this period, he reconnected with his old friend Erwin Rodi. The meeting was a disaster. They saw each other in Leipzig in 1886. Rodi had become a settled, successful professor with a wife and children. Nietzsche was a wandering, half-blind invalid with radical ideas. The gap between them could not be crossed. Rodi later wrote that Nietzsche had seemed like a man from another world, surrounded by an indescribable atmosphere of strangeness. Nietzsche felt the rejection sharply. His old friends now saw him as a pathetic eccentric. He returned to Sils Maria in the summer, seeking the solace of those familiar mountains. He wrote to his friend Heinrich Köselitz, whom he nicknamed Peter Gast, that he was in a state of chronic irritability and needed solitude, absolute solitude. He felt he was being buried alive by the world's indifference. He described himself as a machine that could explode at any moment. The pressure to communicate what he called his transvaluation of all values was building inside him, but he felt there were no ears to hear. The indifference to beyond good and evil did not silence him. It provoked him. He realized he had been too subtle, too aphoristic. If the world would not listen to his whispers, he would shout. He decided to write a supplement that would clarify his dark thoughts on morality, a book that would act as a psychological scalpel, stripping away the skin of Christian civilization to reveal the festering wounds underneath. Chapter 11. The Genealogy of Morals. Back in his refuge at Sils Maria, in July of 1887, Nietzsche received a letter from a publisher requesting a new edition of his earlier works. He took it as a sign. People weren't understanding him. His ideas were being misread, dismissed, or ignored entirely. So he decided to explain himself once and for all, with brutal clarity. What followed was one of the most astonishing feats of concentrated writing in philosophical history. In just 20 days, he produced On the Genealogy of Morals. He called it a polemic, a war weapon. It remains his most systematic book, his most coherent, and perhaps his darkest. Where his previous work had introduced the concepts of master and slave morality, this book would dissect exactly how the inversion happened. He wanted to drag the reader into what he called the dank, dark workshop, where moral values are manufactured. The book is structured as 3 essays, each one a kind of psychological excavation. In the first, he asks us to listen carefully. There's a muttering in the corners of history. It's the sound of weakness, slowly, cunningly, transforming itself into virtue. The weak man cannot defeat the strong man in open combat. He lacks the power. So he does something far more ingenious. He invents a story. In this story, his weakness becomes goodness. His inability to fight becomes peaceful nature. His poverty becomes holiness. And the strong man's power, his health, his vitality that becomes evil. Sin, something to be ashamed of. Nietzsche used a French word for this psychological operation, ressentiment. He felt no German equivalent captured the specific venom of the state he was describing. It wasn't just resentment. It was a festering, creative hatred that produces entirely new values out of its own impotence. The weak don't just dislike the strong. They redefine reality so that weakness wins by definition. He traced this slave revolt in morality to the priestly caste, specifically the Jewish priests and later the Christians. They were, in his view, the geniuses of spiritual revenge, unable to conquer Rome with swords. They conquered it with ideas. They convinced the strong that their strength was a burden, a sin, something requiring confession and atonement. He wrote about this with a kind of shuddering fascination, describing the tarantula of morality that spins webs of guilt to trap the healthy. The second essay shifts focus to guilt and bad conscience. Here Nietzsche makes an observation so simple it's almost embarrassing that no one had made it before. In German, the word for debt, Schuld, is exactly the same as the word for guilt. This isn't a coincidence. Morality, he argued, began as a financial relationship, a creditor and a debtor. If you couldn't pay what you owed, you paid with your body, with pain. He catalogues the gruesome history of punishments with an almost clinical detachment, quartering, boiling in oil, cutting strips of flesh from the living. The cruelty wasn't arbitrary. It was functional. Humanity was burning memory into itself. As he put it, if something is to stay in the memory, it must be burned in. Only that which never ceases to hurt stays in the memory. But where did bad conscience itself come from? Nietzsche's answer is unsettling. When humans first entered civilization, when they built walls and laws and social structures, their old animal instincts suddenly had nowhere to go. The drives for freedom, for aggression, for dominance, couldn't be discharged outwardly anymore, so they turned inward. We started attacking ourselves. This internalized cruelty, this self-torture, is what Nietzsche identifies as the origin of what we call the soul. We became an adventure to ourselves, a torture chamber, a question mark. The third essay tackles ascetic ideals. Why do priests, philosophers, and artists so often praise poverty, chastity, and fasting? Why this recurring worship of self-denial across cultures and centuries? Nietzsche argues that for the philosopher, asceticism is strategic. It's a way to buy freedom for thinking, to escape the distractions of ordinary life. Schopenhauer lived ascetically. Nietzsche himself lived ascetically. But for the priest, the meaning is different and far more troubling. The ascetic priest says no to life itself, no to the body, no to the earth. He treats existence as a wrong road that must be walked backwards. During these months of writing, Nietzsche's isolation deepened further, but he found an unexpected companion in literature. In a bookstore in Nice, he picked up a French translation of Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. The effect was electric. He wrote afterward that he heard the voice of the blood, that the instinct of kinship spoke up immediately. He called Dostoevsky the only psychologist from whom he had anything to learn. Here was someone else obsessed with the dark, irrational underbelly of the human soul. someone who understood the perverse pleasures of self-destruction. His health continued its wild fluctuations. He wrote to his friend Overbeck about his dog-like existence. He was plagued by what he called the weather, his private code for his physiological state. The wet air of Germany destroyed him, he claimed. The dry air of the South kept him alive. He had become a human barometer. In one letter, he described himself as a thing that has no name, a nuance. His old friendships frayed beyond repair. He sent a copy of the Genealogy to Dawson, a friend from his university days. Dawson responded with confusion, suggesting that Nietzsche might be mentally unwell. Nietzsche drafted a brutal reply, though he may never have sent it. "I have done you the honor of sending you a copy," he wrote. "If you cannot understand it, that is not my fault." He was beginning to feel that he was writing for a species that did not yet exist. And yet, to the farmers and shopkeepers of Sils Maria, he remained simply the polite German professor. They saw him walking his usual routes, always neatly dressed in a grey suit, tipping his hat as he passed. He talked to himself sometimes, muttering as he worked through ideas. They had no notion that behind those eyes, behind that heavy moustache, a man was writing books he believed would eventually blow up European civilization. The genealogy was the diagnosis. It explained how we got here, how values were inverted, how guilt was manufactured, how humanity turned against its own instincts. But a diagnosis is only half the work. As 1888 dawned, Nietzsche felt something shift, a sudden euphoric surge of energy. He left the high mountains for the city of Turin, where crisp air and elegant streets triggered a final miraculous explosion of productivity. The time for waiting, he decided, was over. He was ready to declare himself. The Antichrist was about to speak. Chapter 12. The Final Frenzy. In the early months of 1888, Friedrich Nietzsche stepped off a train in Turin and fell in love. He called it my city. The capital of Piedmont stretched before him with its wide flagstone pavements and 17th century architecture, and something in the dry alpine air made him feel, for the first time in years, that his body might actually cooperate with his mind. He was obsessed with the food. After a decade of complaints about swampy German cuisine and greasy Italian boarding houses, he had found a trattoria that served him perfectly. He wrote home about the ossobuco, the tender meat falling from the bone, the grissini breadsticks he declared the finest in the world. He drank water straight from the Po River. He believed he had finally discovered the diet that would cure him, that his machine was oiled and running at last. In this state of physiological euphoria, his productivity became something close to terrifying. 6 months, 4 books. He began with The Case of Wagner, his final settling of accounts with the man who had once been like a father to him. He called Wagner a sickness, a neurosis infecting German culture. Wagner is a great corrupter, he wrote. He makes sick whatever he touches. It was cruel and funny and devastating, and he sent it into the world like a declaration of war. Next came Twilight of the Idols. He said he was philosophizing with a hammer, though he meant something particular by it. He wasn't smashing things. He was tapping them, listening for the hollow sound they made, he tapped the eternal idols of Western thought, reason, morality, God, all hollow. Then the Antichrist. This was the curse on Christianity he had been building toward his entire adult life. He called it the one great intrinsic depravity, the one immortal blemish of mankind. He argued that Christianity had waged war on the higher type of human being, preserving the sick and weak at the expense of the strong. He signed the manuscript with a flourish, the Antichrist. Finally, he wrote his autobiography, Ecce Homo, Behold the Man. The chapter titles alone were enough to startle anyone who picked it up. Why I am so wise, why I am so clever, why I write such good books. It sounds like megalomania, and perhaps it was, but it was also something else. A desperate attempt to be understood before the darkness closed in. He reviewed his own life with clinical precision. His diet, his reading habits, his illnesses. He claimed that sickness had been a gift, allowing him to see reality from angles unavailable to healthy men. He presented himself not as a philosopher, but as dynamite. That year brought the first real signs of fame. A Danish critic named Georg Brandes delivered lectures on Nietzsche's philosophy in Copenhagen, and they were a hit. Brandes wrote to tell him his name was becoming known in the north. Nietzsche wept when he read the letter. He finally had a public. After all those years of printing books at his own expense, of sending copies to friends who never replied, someone was actually listening. But as the months wore on, the letters he sent became increasingly strange. The euphoria curdled into something else entirely. He began talking about great politics, about forming a league of anti-German powers to destroy the Reich. He believed he was influencing world events simply by thinking about them. He walked the streets of Turin in a ragged coat, but he felt like a prince. He smiled at everyone he passed. He bought fruit from the street vendors and claimed they picked out the best pieces for him because they recognized who he was. He called himself the Phoenix. Every face changes when I enter, he wrote. I am treated like a prince. His room at number 6, Via Carlo Alberto, overlooked the piazza. He wrote furiously there, the pen tearing across the paper, convinced he was wrapping up the work of his lifetime. He spent Christmas 1888 alone, but he described himself as surrounded by a halcyon light. He wrote to his mother that he had taken a burden on his shoulders that no one else could carry. He meant the destiny of mankind. The tension in his mind had become unbearable. The high voltage of his intellect was burning out the wires. He was happy, but it was a manic and terrifying happiness. He wrote to August Strindberg that he had ordered a convocation of princes in Rome, that he would have the young Kaiser shot. The line between metaphor and delusion had dissolved completely. He was no longer writing philosophy. He was living a cosmic drama in which he played every role at once: protagonist, victim, God. The wire was about to snap. The dynamite was about to explode, though not in the way he had intended. Chapter 13. The Horse in Turin. The final act begins in late 1888 in a rented room at Via Carlo Alberto 6 inches Turin. The room costs 30 francs a month. It has a view of the piazza. Nietzsche's landlord is a newsagent named Davide Fino, who, along with his wife, has grown accustomed to their quiet German professor. But lately, something has changed. He asks them to remove all the wall hangings. He is expecting, he explains, a visit from the King and Queen of Italy. They find torn-up banknotes in his wastepaper basket. The megalomania that had lived only in his private notebooks now spills into the open, into his letters, into his manner. He writes to the Danish critic Georg Brandes that he is preparing an event that will split history into two halves. 1888 will become year one. He is, he says, the most terrible dynamite the world has ever known. To the playwright August Strindberg, he signs himself Nietzsche, Caesar, and orders a public holiday to celebrate the execution of the German emperor. Strindberg, no stranger to the edges of sanity himself, replies coolly, "It sometimes helps," he writes, "to be mad." On January 3rd, 1889, Nietzsche writes to Meta von Salis that he has entered into possession of his realm. He is throwing the Pope in jail. He is having the anti-Semitic court chaplain Adolf Stöcker shot. The next day, he writes that he is having all anti-Semites shot. A grim pronouncement from a man whose hatred of anti-Semitism had become something close to obsession. The collapse comes on the morning of January 3rd in the Piazza Carlo Alberto. A cab driver is beating a horse that refuses to move. Nietzsche sees this. He rushes to the animal, throws his arms around its neck, and collapses in tears. The scene echoes a dream from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, a book Nietzsche had recently read and admired. Perhaps, even in madness, he was enacting a script he had absorbed from literature. Davide Fino and two policemen carry him back to his room. When they summon a doctor, he refuses to see him. "Pas malade," he shouts. "Pas malade. Not sick, not sick." Fino tells him the doctor is a friend of the family. Only then does he relent. They sedate him with bromide from the Rossetti pharmacy nearby. In Basel, Jacob Burckhardt receives a letter. Nietzsche writes that he would much rather have been a Basel professor than God, but he did not dare push his private egoism so far. He claims to be both Prado and Lesseps. Burckhardt contacts Franz Overbeck immediately. Overbeck consults a psychiatrist, Professor Ludwig Wille, who urges him to get Nietzsche out of Italy at once. If he is incarcerated in a primitive Italian asylum, there may be no retrieving him. Overbeck arrives in Turin on January 7th. He finds his friend huddled in the corner of a sofa, looking like a rubble of his former self, reading the final proofs of Nietzsche contra Wagner. Nietzsche embraces him passionately, then collapses into shivering and groaning. Later, he sits at the piano. The music is loud, crashing, punctuated by screams. He sings fragments of thoughts he has inhabited for years. Occasionally he whispers sentences of what Overbeck later described as wonderful luminosity. He says he is the successor to the dead god. A German dentist named Dr. Bettmann, a stranger who happens to be in Turin, helps Overbeck manage the patient. He persuades Nietzsche to travel to the station by promising a grand reception awaits him at the other end. During the train journey to Basel, Nietzsche is sedated with chloral hydrate. When the drugs wear off, he tries to embrace everyone in the carriage. he sings a gondolier song from his own work, Ecce Homo, a haunting melody of his own composition. They arrive in Basel on January 10th. At the Friedmatt Clinic, Nietzsche greets Dr. Will with urbane politeness. "I believe we have met," he says. "I am sorry to say I have forgotten your name." When reminded, he recalls accurately that they had once discussed religious insanity together. The clinic records describe him singing, dancing, leaping about in goat-like bounds, a grotesque parody of the Dionysian ecstasy he had preached. On January 17th, he is transferred to a clinic in Jena to be closer to his mother. The journey is a nightmare. His face becomes a mask. He lashes out. He requires sedation. Overbeck watches the train depart and feels, he later wrote, that it might have been the office of a friend to take Nietzsche's life rather than deliver him to the asylum. At Jena, under Professor Otto Binswanger, the intake ledger records his religion as Protestant. The diagnosis is progressive paralysis caused by syphilis. He is presented to medical students in a lecture hall as a specimen. He speaks lucidly for a moment about the beauty of Turin. The students are spellbound by his style. Then he lapses into gibberish. His friend Heinrich Köselitz visits and hears him improvising at the piano. Chords full of the spirit of Tristan, he wrote, with trumpet fanfares of Beethoven-like grimness. The musical genius remains intact, even as the intellect disintegrates. But he regresses into infantilism. He suffers paranoid delusions. He believes he is being tortured at night. He thinks an archduchess is trying to poison him. He smashes a window because he sees a rifle barrel behind it. His mother, Franziska, devoted and pious, moves him into a private house in Jena in March of 1890. Here he is calmer. He plays Beethoven sonatas. He walks with her. Then one day he escapes, strips naked, and tries to swim in a lake. He is returned to stricter custody. Eventually, the decision is made to bring him home to Naumburg. The Antichrist returned to the care of the little pastor's mother. The circle of his wanderings closes in a place he had spent his whole life trying to escape. Chapter 14. The Sister and the Lie. In May of 1890, Nietzsche was installed in his mother's house at 18 Weingarten in Naumburg. He lived upstairs, cared for by Franziska and a loyal servant named Alwine. The lectures by Georg Brandes mentioned earlier were now bearing fruit. Essays comparing the philosopher to Hamlet appeared in major journals. "What a noble mind is here o'erthrown," one critic wrote. And the man himself sat in a chair by the window, staring at the wall, sinking slowly into apathy and paralysis. As we saw, Elisabeth had left for Paraguay with her husband Bernhard Pforta to establish their Aryan colony. That dream was now collapsing. Nueva Germania had descended into debt, swindling, and incompetence. On the 3rd of June 1889, Forster checked into a hotel room and swallowed a mixture of morphine and strychnine. Elisabeth attempted to maintain the fraud for years afterward, even bribing a doctor to certify the death as a heart attack. But eventually, the settlers turned on her, calling her a liar and a thief. She fled back to Germany in 1893. Upon her return, she legally changed her name to Förster Nietzsche. That hyphen did something interesting. It chained her brother's name to the anti-Semite he had despised. And Elisabeth quickly recognized that the Nietzsche business held far more potential than the failed Paraguayan timber business ever had. Her brother's fame was growing. She intended to own it. Her first move was to evict Heinrich Köselitz, the devoted friend who had been preparing a critical edition of Nietzsche's writings. She screamed at him, "Who made you editor?" She ordered his 5 completed volumes to be pulped. She would have total control, or nothing at all. She established the Nietzsche archive on the ground floor of the Naumburg house. It became a kind of shrine to the brother she kept imprisoned upstairs. She held readings of his works for visitors, performances that were occasionally interrupted by the groans and howls of the madman from the floor above. She pressured her mother relentlessly to hand over the copyright to Nietzsche's works. She eventually succeeded by securing a bank loan which she falsely presented as a gift from anonymous admirers. She bought the rights for 30,000 marks. She hired editors to prepare new editions. One of them, Fritz Kögel, soon discovered her plan to suppress and forge texts. He began keeping a secret record of the actual manuscripts versus her edited versions. Rudolf Steiner, the future founder of anthroposophy, attempted to teach Elisabeth the basics of her brother's philosophy. He gave up. She lacked, he noted, all understanding of fine and even of crude logical distinctions. She had no respect for facts or objectivity. The most infamous fraud was the creation of a book called The Will to Power. Nietzsche had abandoned this project in 1888, deciding the material was better used in The Antichrist and Twilight of the Idols. But Elisabeth took his discarded notes, his jumbled laundry lists, his rejected aphorisms. She stitched them together to create a systematic magnum opus that Nietzsche never intended to publish. She arranged the fragments to support her own nationalist views, creating the impression of a coherent philosophy of power. It would serve as a Bible for the later German right wing. She was venting her own will to power through his dead voice. In 1896, she moved the archive to the Villa Silberblick in Weimar, a grand house, funded by a wealthy patron named Meta von Sales. She was placing Nietzsche in the city of Goethe and Schiller, cementing his status as a national monument. She dressed the invalid in white, pleated, priestly robes. He looked like something between a Brahmin and a biblical prophet. She placed him on a veranda to be viewed by select visitors, turning him into a silent, living icon of her new religion. She controlled access ruthlessly. When visitors came, she staged the encounters so that Nietzsche appeared as a silent mystic staring into the distance. They did not know he was merely catatonic. She wrote a biography of her brother which systematically lied about his life. She invented a happy childhood. She suppressed the influence of Lou Salomé, claiming she was a Finnish Jew. She wrote herself into the center of his intellectual development, claiming he called her his Lama out of respect for her wisdom. She destroyed letters and documents that contradicted her narrative. She purged his correspondence of his vitriolic attacks on her and her husband's anti-Semitism. She invited the Weimar elite to the villa, transforming herself into the high priestess of the Nietzsche cult. She received the accolades that were meant for him, basking in the reflected glory of an intellect she never understood. The ultimate irony is her success. By the time of her death in 1935, she had firmly established Nietzsche as the philosopher of German imperialism. The distortion was so complete that Hitler himself would visit the archive to pay homage. The dynamite had been diffused and repackaged as a national monument. Chapter 15. Becoming Who You Are. The Villa Silberblick stood on a hill in Weimar, with views stretching across the German countryside. But the man inside could no longer see them. For the last 3 years of his life, Friedrich Nietzsche sat in a wheelchair or lay in bed, his once fierce eyes now dim and vacant. The philosopher who had declared war on the foundations of Western thought would occasionally mutter stock phrases. "I am dead," he would say. Or, "I am stupid." The mind that had produced Zarathustra was gone. And yet, something flickered in the darkness. When music played, he would stir. When Elisabeth read to him from his own works, he seemed to recognize the rhythm of his prose, though the meaning had long since escaped him. The body remembered what the mind could not. His old friend Erwin Rodi came to visit. Nietzsche stared through him like a stranger. Only Overbeck remained faithful, rushing to his side whenever a crisis loomed, bearing witness to the ruins of the man he had once known. On the 25th of August, 1900, Nietzsche contracted pneumonia. His body, weakened by a decade of paralysis and neglect, could not fight the infection. He died around noon, just weeks before his 56th birthday. The wanderer who had spent years searching for the perfect climate, the perfect altitude, the perfect light, was finally still. And then came the funeral, which was a masterpiece of irony. Elisabeth arranged it all. She buried the self-declared Antichrist with a full Lutheran church service in the village church of Roken. The local pastor preached a sermon over the man who had written, "God is dead." Nietzsche was laid to rest in the family plot, beside the father he had loved and lost at 4 years old. The homeless one, the stateless wanderer, was returned to the earth of his ancestors. He was trapped between the pious virtue of his family and the lies of his sister, even in death. Peter Gast, despite everything Elisabeth had done to him, pronounced the benediction at the grave. "Holy be thy name to all coming generations," he said, as if Nietzsche were the founder of a new religion. It was an odd tribute to a man who had spent his life attacking religion. But then, odd tributes were all that awaited him. The tragedy of his afterlife began almost immediately. The will to power, that fraudulent patchwork Elisabeth had stitched together from discarded notes, became a standard text. During the First World War, German soldiers carried Zarathustra in their knapsacks alongside the Bible. They misread his call for self-overcoming as a call for military conquest. They turned the philosopher of radical individualism into a prophet of national aggression. The appropriation reached its grotesque peak in 1934, when Adolf Hitler visited the Nietzsche archive. Elisabeth presented him with her brother's walking stick. Hitler was photographed gazing at a bust of the philosopher. The thinker who had loathed anti-Semites and nationalists above all else was being absorbed into the pantheon of National Socialism. Elisabeth had finally delivered her brother to the very people he despised. But the real Nietzsche eventually broke free. After the Second World War, scholars like Walter Kaufmann and Giorgio Colli uncovered the frauds of the archive. They restored the texts. They revealed the radical individualist beneath the fascist distortion. The forgeries were exposed, and slowly, painstakingly, the man emerged from behind the propaganda. What they found was a philosopher who had asked the hardest question imaginable: amor fati, love of fate. Nietzsche's life had been a catalogue of suffering, physical pain that left him vomiting for days, loneliness so profound he went years without meaningful companionship, betrayal by his sister, rejection by the woman he loved, abandonment by his closest friends, and then madness, 11 years of it, trapped in a body that would not die. Yet his philosophy was an attempt to affirm all of it. The eternal recurrence was his ultimate test. Could you live your life over and over again, identically forever? Every migraine, every humiliation, every cold boarding house, and every unanswered letter, every moment of boredom, and every flash of insight. Would you curse the demon who offered you this fate, or would you call him a god? Nietzsche's answer was yes. He did not seek some other world to redeem his suffering. He found redemption in the creative act of accepting his life and shaping it, however terrible. He became the Dionysian man he had prophesied, one who could face the terror of existence without turning to the comfort of religion or the escape of idealism. His legacy is a challenge, nothing more. He left no system, no church, no party. "I am no shepherd," he wrote. "I am no man-catcher." He did not want followers. He wanted you to follow yourself. The final image is perhaps the truest one: a solitary walker in Sils Maria, 6,000 feet above the sea, scribbling in a small notebook as the alpine light fades. He is teaching us, in his cramped handwriting, that the ultimate greatness is to become who you are, to craft your own values in the face of an indifferent universe, to say yes to the weight of existence. On a stone in Sils Maria, there is an inscription from Zarathustra: "O man, take care. What does the deep midnight declare? The world is deep, deeper than the day could read. Joy wants eternity, wants deep, deep eternity." Epilogue: How to read like a parasite. The story does not end in the madness of Turin. It does not end at the funeral in Roken, with the church service that would have made the Antichrist roll his eyes. And it does not end with Elisabeth's forgeries, however much we might wish it did. The story continues into the glass-walled offices of Silicon Valley, into the boardrooms of the 21st century, into the very air we breathe when we talk about personal brands and authentic selves and becoming who we are. Nietzsche won. That much is clear. Steve Jobs never read the philosopher, apparently, but his biographer noted that he lived by what could only be called a Nietzschean code, creating his own values, bending reality to his will. The sociologist Andreas Reckwitz has a term for what we've become: a society of singularities. We must all curate ourselves now. We must all become unique brands. To be part of the herd is the modern shame, the thing we scroll through Instagram to avoid. The ancient command to know thyself has become something else entirely. It has become a competition. a life and death struggle to produce a unique way of life, an authentic persona, a marketable soul, and in this contest there are winners and losers. The losers get that word we all dread now, that Nietzschean slur, basic. But how did this happen? How did a philosopher who died raving in his sister's care become the unacknowledged legislator of neoliberalism? Part of the answer lies in what happened after the Second World War, a deliberate intellectual operation designed to scrub the Nazi stink off his reputation. We might call it a hermeneutics of innocence. The chief architect was a translator named Walter Kaufmann. He became the gatekeeper of Nietzsche for the English-speaking world, and he did his job with surgical precision. Brutal German words were softened. Vernichtung, which means extermination, became the gentler destruction. Züchtung, which means breeding, became education or raising. The aristocratic radicalism, the explicit demands for slavery and the annihilation of the weak were quietly ushered out of the room. What remained was a sanitized figure, a misunderstood poet, a counterculture rebel. The baby boomers and the new left could adopt him now. He hated institutions, he hated the state, he hated conformity. He was perfect for 1968. Students who had never read a page of the Genealogy of Morals knew they were supposed to become Übermenschen. Professors received visits from young people complaining of schizophrenic episodes induced by trying to live Nietzsche as a guide to revolutionary life. The French philosopher Gilles Deleuze cemented this image, a nomadic Nietzsche, a disembodied kit of tools for decoding capitalist repression. The will to power became a weapon against bureaucratic stagnation, against the dead hand of the state. What was conveniently ignored was that Nietzsche himself had plotted against the working class with considerable enthusiasm. And yet, the most fascinating appropriations came from people Nietzsche would have dismissed as failures, as slaves, as herd animals. Huey Newton, the Black Panther leader, sat in a jail cell repurposing the will to power. He took the concept of the transvaluation of values, the trick Nietzsche claimed the Jews used against the Romans, and applied it to the American police. By coining the slur pig, Newton aimed to strip the oppressor of their invincibility. The terrifying white policeman became a grotesque, unclean animal in the eyes of the black community. It was a perfect Nietzschean inversion, designed to unhinge existing identities, designed to create power among the very people Nietzsche's philosophy sought to crush. The socialist novelist Jack London wrestled with what he called the Nietzsche virus. He was seduced by the blonde beast, the celebration of strength, the contempt for the weak. But he also knew his own peers, the working class, and he described them as men wrenched and twisted out of shape by toil. He tried to reverse the formula, to put the proletariat in the position of the strong, but he remained trapped in the wolf mindset. The aristocratic disdain for the passive mass is hard to shake once it gets into your bones. These appropriations are fascinating. They prove the philosophy can be reverse-engineered, but they cannot erase the Janus face of the actual project. Nietzsche was never merely aesthetic. He was fundamentally political. There was a continuous polemic against Marxism and socialism running through his work, a terror of the Paris Commune of 1871 that shaped everything he wrote afterward. The death of God was never just a theological observation, it was a political crisis. Without the Christian promise of heaven to pacify the poor, the socialist tide might rise up and demand happiness here on earth. Nietzsche viewed this demand as madness. The utopia he actually envisioned was a hyper-capitalist caste system. Hard work and misery would be allotted to the dullest man, shielding a small elite of higher men who required leisure time to create high art. He advocated explicitly for a pathos of distance, a physical and spiritual separation between the noble and the plebeian. The slavery of the many was, for him, a necessary condition for the highest existence of the few. The concept of ressentiment is still deployed today, against woke mobs, against grievance politics, against anyone who complains too loudly about injustice. But we should remember what it was originally for. It was weaponized to delegitimize the valid anger of the working class. Their demand for justice was reframed as toxic envy, vengeful sickness, biological inferiority. Even the doctrine of eternal return was intended as a weapon for the ruling class, a tool to naturalize the brutality of capitalism and enforce stoic acceptance. The subaltern classes would abandon their hopes and illusions of a better future. They would say yes to the wheel. The danger of trying to make Marx and Nietzsche friends is that the reactionary core slips in through the back door. Leftists become elitists who despise the herd. Aesthetic rebellion takes priority over collective solidarity. The monster wins wearing a liberating mask. There is another way to read him. Early socialists like Kurt Eisner called it parasitical reading. You enter the Nietzschean labyrinth, but you go looking for an exit, not a home. You acknowledge the monster within the text while using its theoretical surplus to sharpen your own weapons. You sweat out the toxin. You take his critique of the last man, his insights into the poverty of the psyche under capitalism, and you direct that energy against the very class structure he sought to protect. We should remember that the higher men in Zarathustra turned out to be frauds. They fled at the first sign of trouble. The community Nietzsche builds is based on a lie. The goal is to become something else. Marx had a term for it, the old mole, burrowing beneath the fortress of bourgeois society rather than floating above it as a free spirit. We use Nietzsche's insights into power, into masks, into cruelty. We learn how the enemy thinks, but we refuse his pathos of distance in favor of radical democratization. We accept him as an enemy, a productive enemy. He teaches us that the class struggle is psychological and cultural, that it takes place in the realm of values and not just wages. We take his weapons. We learn his codes. And then, like the lion in the desert, we roar back. We tear down the walls of the cave entirely. The mask is off now. The dynamite has exploded. We know how the hermeneutics of innocence disarmed us for so long, turning a political philosopher into a self-help guru for ambitious entrepreneurs. What remains is to sift through the rubble and find what can be used to build something new, something that would make Zarathustra tremble.